Yeah, I'm not gonna sit through a whole video wearing these. It's definitely actually my aim to tell you about Canada, not to be a bit of a pillock. So, I've been living in Canada for 5 years now. Canada. Hello, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Rebecca Felgate and I am a British girl living in Toronto. I've been here for 5 years. I got my permanent residency a few years ago and I quit my job last year working in the city. I now work for myself full-time as a social media influencer. I know, boo, hiss, and also a social media consultant. If you follow me on Instagram, I'm at Miss Rebecca J. I post a lot about Toronto, Canada in general, and definitely focused on showcasing how much of a fantastic place Canada is and Toronto is. I actually made a video 5 years ago on this channel about my journey of moving to Canada, and I recently watched that back and I've become kind of a different human than I was when I was living in London and living in the UK.
Tonight is my last night in my flat. I'm leaving this city in 4 weeks' time and moving to Canada.
Obviously, a lot of people change over a 5-year period, but living in Canada has definitely shaped who I've become as an adult woman. I moved over in 2015 with my ex-boyfriend. We got 2-year working holiday visas. If you're under the age of 30, they are pretty easy to come by if you live in Europe or a Commonwealth country. It's a little bit of admin and a small fee, and I think you need to arrive with a few $1,000s in the bank. But other than that, they don't ask too many questions. It's a 2-year thing. The reason we got the working holiday visa in the first place to move to Canada wasn't overwhelmingly thought out. It was largely whimsy. We were a little bit tired with London. It was a bit of a slog. I'd been living in London for 8 years. We felt like our possibilities as young people were pretty restricted. So we wanted to see a bit more of the world and understand a little bit more before settling down somewhere. We chose Canada because it isn't overwhelmingly far away from the UK, so I could get home to my family within 8 hours if I wanted to. My sister lived in Australia when she was younger, and that obviously was a way further adventure. Plane tickets to Toronto and back, not restrictively expensive. Also, we'd heard good things about Canada. It has a very strong international profile. Canadians are said to be very friendly. The standard of living is always rated quite highly. Music and theatre and food seemed like they were going to be great things out here, so we thought, do you know what, let's do it. A few years into the move, I did break up with the boyfriend who I moved here with. He stayed in Canada and I stayed in Canada because we both loved it separately. That could have been a time that we would have been inspired to go home and sort of recover, but we both loved Canada so much that we decided to stay. I'm going to go into what made me want to stay, but I will say after that 2 years, we decided to apply for permanent residency, which we got. This is my permanent residency card. This was a lot harder to come by than the 2-year work visa. There was quite a lot of admin involved. You have to do an English test, even though, you know, you're from the UK. I don't want to bore you if you're looking into doing that kind of thing. I'm sure there are YouTube videos out there that can guide you through how to do it. All I will say is that it was quite a lot of admin, but worth it in the end. The ultimate cost of applying for permanent residency was around $2,000, maybe slightly more, and about a year of my time. But I'm here and now I'm looking into applying for citizenship soon. So I never want to give up my British passport because it is still a big part of me, but I definitely would like to move forward in my life also being a Canadian. I have got thousands of reasons why I love Canada, and I want to share some of them with you so you know why I loved it when I came and it made me want to stay, because originally it was just supposed to be a 2-year thing. So I lived in London in England before moving to Toronto, and London is a fantastic city, but it's also a kind of a draining city. I found Toronto to be a bit more open and easy to explore than London, and I found working in a creative industry, it was a lot easier for me to get a job in Toronto than it was for me to get a job in London. When I lived in the UK, I graduated from Goldsmiths with a first-class honours degree in theatre. I then did a journalism postgrad, and I eventually ended up working for a theatre publication that also sold tickets. We reviewed theatre shows. I used to make the odd video about theatre. that was kind of where I was. But what I really wanted to do was be a TV presenter or radio host, and I did try, and I ended up doing a few things for free in the UK, but it was difficult to get on that particular job ladder in Toronto. It just sort of happened. I auditioned for a company that owns the channel Most Amazing Top 10 when I got here, and within a month I'd been offered that job. I also immediately started writing for a publication called the Toronto Guardian that allowed me to get out and review food experiences and bars in the city. I think the reason it was easier for me to get a job here is I can't deny the fact that my accent might have helped me get a job here. I know that's a weird thing to say, but I do think it's true. They do like British people out here. But that being said, I feel like the UK is very strict with its credentials and background, what kind of family you come from, what kind of university you went to, sort of things that might be determined by economics beyond your control. Whereas in Toronto, I feel like people really take you at face value. Nobody really cares about your family history or even so much what school you went to. They care whether you can do a good job, and showing up and proving yourself is really the only proof that they need, from my experience in Canada. I felt like in the UK, especially as a young person, I was always having to fight my way into rooms and clamber my way to the top, and I was really uncomfortable with what that meant in terms of my relationships with other people. Wide sweeping generalization, but I will say that it feels like people in general, Canadians in general, are just more welcoming. I feel like in Canada, you could show up to a social gathering with a friend and everyone would be pleased to see them. Whereas in the UK, we're quite cliquey, and showing up with somebody new unannounced just isn't really accepted. Whereas here, I'd say that's almost encouraged. Like, it really just boils down to there being a far more welcoming vibe. Moving away from social issues, I have to say, one of the biggest sells on Canada is that it is stunningly beautiful. Like, stunningly beautiful. I live in Ontario, and a lot of the rest of Canada sort of laugh at Ontario because they don't think it's as pretty as the other provinces, but we have so many lakes that most of them don't even have names. We've got cottage country, we've got woods and forests. It's just like absolutely stunning. If we had lakes that stunning in the UK, we would have absolutely capitalized on them, and they would be big spots for tourism. Whereas here, you can stumble across a lake that might not have been seen in, I don't know, the past 5 years and get that experience privately to yourself. There are so many provincial parks out here and incredible wildlife. In Ontario, there's a provincial park reasonably near me called Algonquin, where I've been camping and portaging a few times, and it is just stunning. And like I said, a lot of people don't even give Toronto enough credit as being a beautiful province, because there's Alberta and BC, the mountains. I went to Banff last year, and it was like an experience I felt in my heart because it was so gorgeous. The scenery literally took my breath away, and it just isn't something that we get to experience in the UK. I know that we do have some nice landscapes, but the diversity of the terrain here is magnificent. I haven't been to Vancouver yet. In fact, as COVID hit, I was supposed to be getting a train from Toronto to Vancouver with Danny, and it was cancelled 3 days before we were supposed to go. And that train was going to take us across the country, and we were going to see so much scenery. It was going to be amazing. We're hoping to reschedule that once it becomes a bit safer to travel, because I cannot wait to see all of that firsthand. I have been to the Maritimes. They are gorgeous too. That's the Atlantic side of Canada, and the coastline is so rugged. I've been to the Pacific West to Victoria, and that was really beautiful too. Honestly, no one ever says, Canada, a bit ugly, because it's just not. Probably, I haven't been to all of the countries in the world, but some of the most stunning sights I've ever seen have been in Canada. And perhaps it's got something to do with the unspoiled, abundant nature around us, but I get the sense that people in Canada are just way more up for a bit of outdoorsy fun than the UK. You can live in a city here, but also be a really outdoorsy kind of person. Like I mentioned earlier, cottage country is a big thing. A lot of people will go to cottages in the summer where they'll do water sports like canoeing and kayaking. People love hiking and getting in nature. skiing as well, because the winters are so snowy here. Just a lot of people are active and up for some kind of sporting adventure, which I think is great. I did used to go camping when I lived in the UK, but I was among the minority of my friendship group, I would say, that really enjoyed that kind of thing. Whereas here, most people are keen and down, and if they've never been, they're down to try it. I mentioned the snow there, and this is one thing that people often ask me about all of the time back home. How do I deal with the winters in Canada? I'm going to say something that maybe is kind of shocking, but I like the weather in Canada better than I do back home. Yes, the winters are insane. I have lived through some of the coldest days in my life, and I'm in Toronto where it's not even that bad compared to, say, Montreal. The coldest I have ever felt it in the city, I think, was with wind chill around -37, which, if you say that back home, it's unfathomable. The coldest I think it's ever been for me while I was living in London is about -5, and at that point people are dying and, you know, you're barely making it into work. Whereas I've walked across the centre of town for an hour in -20 weather and I've been absolutely fine. The big difference is that we have clothing and insulation to deal with it here, but I've never really found the winter to be much of a big problem. We have a lot of blue sky days in the winter, which are a real saviour. It's super cold, but if you can see a blue sky and you can see the sun, it doesn't feel that bad. Whereas I know that in the UK, the winter is pretty much drizzle and more drizzle. It does get tiring here between the months of January to March, where you're thinking like, come on, let's just get into spring, and it's still cold. And I noticed that the UK gets warmer a bit quicker, so perhaps you'll have sunnier days earlier on in the year and it will still very much feel like winter here, and that's a bit of a drag. But when spring comes, it's very short and very sweet, and then it's basically 4 months to 5 months of very good summer. The summers are fantastic on the east coast of Canada. It is really warm and like predictably warm as well. I feel like in the UK, you couldn't plan for a hot day. Whereas here, I know that between the months of May to September, I'm probably just gonna have a lovely day out. And it does rain a bit, but usually they're quite tropical storms that are over very quickly. You don't get very many, if any, grey sky days in the summer. I know that on the west coast it's a little bit different, but generally speaking it is just more temperate there. And I do hear, but can't speak exactly for the experience, that the weather is still quite a bit better than the UK. One thing I love about Canada that is very suited to me as a person living here is that we've got some really fantastic wine regions. Now, I know that the UK has started producing wine in the south because the climate's changing a bit, but I personally had never been to a winery in the UK. It's not particularly popular. I know that our English sparkling wines are getting a good rep, and I'd love to check those out, but I imagine it's quite an exclusive experience. Whereas, especially living in Toronto, I've got access to amazing wine country. A lot of people don't seem to realise that Canada is a very big producer of wine. We've got the Niagara wine region, we've got Prince Edward County, the Okanagan, and then there's a few others speckled around, like Pelee Island, for example. Pelee Island, I know, is on the same parallel as the winemaking regions of France, and in Niagara, my closest wine country, there's the escarpment that allows for the right climate to produce wine. For me, it's such an adventure being able to go out to the vineyards and sample local wine. I haven't been to the Okanagan yet, which is the wine region in the west, but I also hear that that is fantastic. Perhaps the reason that we do have our own wine region is the reason that Canadians seem to be really interested in food and drink. I don't know if those two things are related, but they are, at least the ones that I meet, and perhaps that's not a fair test because that's something that I'm really into, so maybe the friends I've made kind of reflect that. But generally speaking, I feel like the food and drink culture here is way more universally embraced than it is in the UK. I lived in London for 8 years, and London is home to some of the best restaurants in the world, but I feel like dining is a bit more of an exclusive thing there. Yeah, we have some really great casual places to eat, but fine dining experiences, it locks you out. I think that eating out here, but not drinking, eating out here in general is cheaper, and it's something that people do more regularly, and I really like that. People just seem to really be into the food and drink culture. it's a bit less exclusive and more accessible. And I just feel like in Toronto, there are so many independent, fantastic restaurants to try. And I don't remember it being that way in London. I also think that the food scene in Canada, or maybe I should say Toronto because that's the scene that I'm immersed in, doesn't get enough credit. We have some really cool places and really innovative places, and our cocktail and bar culture is amazing. There is a cocktail bar in Toronto called Bar Chef that creates kind of like culinary cocktails, and I never saw anything like that in London while I was there. And if that did or does exist now, I imagine it's like very, very expensive. I do think that we pioneer things here and people are really down and willing to try it. So back to that cocktail culture, it's not just Toronto that embraces it. Also, Montreal, fantastic for cocktails. Halifax, there are some good spots around the city. I hear that Vancouver is fantastic for cocktails. In fact, I know that from some people I've worked with, but unfortunately, once again, I still haven't been there yet. I went to Victoria where they make Empress Gin, and it was great there too. We also do have some really great Canadian spirits being produced here, and gin's one of my favorites, so it's easy for me to talk about Empress Gin over to the west, and then we have Romeo's Gin made in Montreal, which I just think are some of the best gins I've ever tried. I've also noted everywhere I've been in Canada, we're really into microbreweries. And yes, I definitely miss pubs in England, good old man pubs and a good real ale, but I love all of the little beers being made out here. They're like small batch beers that you get to try in breweries, and you can go to the breweries where the beers are actually being made and have flights of beer. I love that in Toronto. We've got so many of them, but it does seem to be a trend across the whole country. People are just very involved in craft beer. There are a lot of reasons that I love Toronto specifically. I know that we've got a very big music scene, a big theatre scene. These two things have been pretty affected by COVID, but I'm speaking about my experience sort of pre-COVID. I don't know what's going to happen after. I'm hoping that these industries can recover, because definitely living in Toronto, the music and theatre scene was a big sell for me wanting to stay. In London, obviously there is so much more theatre. I get that, and I do miss there being a big variety, but it's still nice to know that there are several very big theatres downtown if you want to take in that kind of culture. Canada's very into its sports, and in Toronto we've got a lot of big sporting teams. We've got the Maple Leafs, who I've never seen, but we also have the Toronto Marlies, which are also an ice hockey team, bit smaller, so more affordable, and it's really great that you can go there with a friend, have some beers and be immersed in the sport. For me, having never seen a hockey game until I moved here, that was really, really cool. There's baseball, the Toronto Blue Jays, and of course basketball. The Toronto Raptors won the NBA last year, and they're a really great team, and the whole city just gets behind them when they're playing. There's also Toronto FC, which are a football or soccer club. So if you are a diehard football fan, you can watch it here. It's not the same, but it does still exist. And there are plenty of people that do support European football in Canada as well, and you can enjoy it and watch it with them. I watched the last World Cup here and it was fun, really fun. There's also rugby as well, Toronto Wolfpack. I've seen a few of their games. Cities have a lot of green spaces here, and places that aren't cities generally are green spaces. There's so many places across the whole country to hike, but in Toronto specifically, I love the fact that we've got parks, and the Toronto Island is one of my favourite places in the world. I might not live amongst the mountains in Banff, but I can go to the Toronto Island, and that's like being on a little vacation of your very own. Generally speaking as well, living costs are lower here. Rent is a really, really big one. I showed you around my London flat in the video I made when I left, and it was so tiny. The house that I'm living in now in Toronto is less than 2/3 of the price of what my house was in London, and I would say it's twice the size. It's a much more livable situation here. And I hear that Toronto rent is really expensive, so I can't even imagine it must be really cheap across the rest of the country. And I know some of you are going to be watching this and you're not living in London, so maybe that's not a factor for you, but it definitely was a big factor for me to find a city that offered a good quality of life. I feel like in London you have to be earning quite a lot of money to be having the quality of life that I have here now, earning a very average wage. The biggest deal for me with Canada, and the reason that I really wanted to stay, and I think my ex-boyfriend did too, was the difference in attitude between Canadians and British people. Obviously I am British, a lot of my family and friends are. I've noticed that we've been kind of conditioned to be guilty, and that guilt often leads to a weird kind of jealousy. In the UK, I definitely felt guilty about not dedicating my life to like knuckling down and my job and things like that, whereas it's not so much the case here. And in the UK, I feel like we look around at what others have way more than we focus on what we could have if we wanted it. For example, I feel like in the UK we can be a little bit judgmental and maybe sometimes a bit jealous. So for example, somebody else goes on holiday and to their face you would say, oh, very nice, but like behind closed doors, a lot of people have a lot of opinions and judgment about that kind of thing. Generally speaking, I find the UK a much more judgmental place to be in, whereas here people are like, cool, you do your thing, just you be happy. My experience of Canadians is that they definitely give themselves permission to live mostly free, fun lives. Here, people care a lot less about what you do for a living and about who your family are. They just care about who you are. I don't know if it's because Canada is a younger country. This is a good point that Danny raised as well. In Canada, it definitely feels more like Canada can be whatever you want it to be. There is no one ideal Canadian. People live and have experiences to Canada in different ways, and that's okay and that's celebrated. Whereas in the UK, I feel like if you want to live there, the general expectation is that you have to bend yourself towards an ideal sort of way and standard of living. But there are some things I don't like about Canada. So for balance, I want to tell you what they are too. I guess one of the biggest things in Canada is that there is still a bit of a friction between Indigenous original owners of the land and new Canadians that needs to be addressed. There's still a lot of truth and reconciliation that needs to happen there. But of course, I also realise that the UK kind of has its own problems there and needs to reconcile with its past too. So I really miss easier travel. Living in the UK means that you can easily travel pre-COVID to Europe for cheap, whereas here it's actually expensive to travel even within the own country. So to go to Montreal or Quebec or Vancouver, it's quite expensive. The train, for example, to Montreal, Danny and I went last year, it's a 6-hour train and it was around $250 return, which it was expensive. I also kind of miss how densely populated the UK is in some ways, because it would be easy to get to an entirely different town or city within an hour, whereas things are a lot more sparse here in Canada. And I'm even saying that living in Toronto, where that's not really as much of a big problem. There's the whole prairies in the middle of the country where there's barely anything going on. And even in Toronto, it feels like you've got to make quite a big effort to be in a new space. You definitely need to be able to drive, because public transport here just isn't where it's at in the UK and Europe. Okay, this is a smallish thing, but it does annoy me. Banking out here is not as good as it is in the UK. I know, how boring, but like I often get paid in checks, and I don't think anyone has written a check in the UK since 1993, but it's still going strong out here in Canada. Also, you kind of need a credit card, which was not something I ever had in the UK. A lot of people live their life on credit here, whereas I was much more comfortable having a debit card and paying for what I had. Either way, whatever you want to do, that's fine, but a lot of places don't take debit card. Like hiring a car, I have to pay because I've got a credit card because I'm a permanent resident. Small issue, Canadians like their beer way too cold. So cold, it has to be ice cold. Why? Why? So for example, I do feel like Canadians are embracing darker beers like stout, but they serve them so cold you can barely taste the flavour. I know Canadians might be watching this being like, that's how we like it, but ugh. On this one, I have to say, you're wrong. I love that everyone here embraces sports, and I also really like how sports is a family thing here rather than sort of can be a bit hooligan-y in the UK. But the one thing I will say about sports is that they have the same chant for everything. So, let's go Blue Jays is the same as let's go Raptors. And you're like, where are the ingenious chants that our good old British hooligans have thought up so artfully? Again, not really a big issue. Alcohol's more expensive here. I think perhaps the taxes are higher, but in the UK, we can definitely drink from stores and also in restaurants a lot cheaper. But the good news is that I think this makes me a little bit more mindful about how much I buy. Groceries are more expensive, and this does annoy me. So for example, a pepper, like a bell pepper, instead of being, I don't know, 50p in the UK, I've lost touch, it's like about £2 out here, or $3. It's really expensive. Fresh fruit and vegetables are way more expensive to buy in Canada. You can buy like cheese in a can and grotesque things like that, but actually things that are good for you, you're gonna pay more for. Speaking of cheese in Canada is a problem for me. It's not great. In the UK, we have some very, very good cheese, and also we have imports from France, very cheap. If you want good cheese here, you have to pay $10 or more for it. We barely have anything that's unpasteurized. Even bad cheese is expensive. But again, on the good side, I guess, I mean, I eat less cheese, but also is that even a good thing? Because I miss cheese. Annoyingly, because the country's so small, there are a lot of monopolies on things. So for example, there are only a few different people that you can do your internet and phone with. And because there are only a few, they can charge a lot and aren't particularly accountable. Well, our internet in our house is terrible, but there's barely anything that we can do about it. And it's way more expensive than it is in the UK. Phones and internet, so expensive here. I love Canada so much, and nature's architecture is so much more beautiful than anything the UK can yield, but the human architecture, not so much. In the UK and Europe, obviously we've got a lot of old buildings and old timey places to be. There's a lot of history. In Canada, that's definitely not something that is so abundant. There aren't old castles or sort of old 13th century constructions, buildings and things. So you don't really feel like you're living in history. But perhaps that's the problem with the UK and Europe. People are very much still kind of living in the past. But yeah, I definitely miss, like, I don't know, an old beautiful cobblestone street. And someone will tell me, oh, you can find one in Montreal. But that's what I'm talking about. I don't have to go 6 hours away to find one cobblestone street. Not the Canadians that I know and I'm friends with, because I think we're all a bit more similar. But generally speaking, I do feel there's a slight less willingness to travel from Canadians. I know that a lot of people haven't left the country or the continent, more likely. And I find that strange. And I understand because the country's so big and vast and there are so many places to go here. But I don't know, you don't meet that many people that have made it over to Europe. Ultimately though, the good so far outweighs the bad. I love Canada. It has won me over forever. For me, it really boils down to the beauty of the scenery and the attitude of the people. To be Canadian is to be malleable, and to be British, I think, not for everyone, but is to be pretty rigid. And I just love living in this slightly freer country where I feel like anything is possible for me. Whereas back home, as a young person graduating from uni, I felt like the possibilities were definitely quite limited. This is just my 2 cents. I know some of you watching this might not agree with me, but I wanted to share with you a personal video about why I moved to Canada and why I loved it. If you're thinking of moving, I would say, do it. You can always move back. I think that's one of the biggest things that I didn't realize at the time. It felt like such a grand move, but like, home's there, you can always go back home. I always feel like I have so much to say, so it's difficult to wrap up a video, but I hope you enjoyed my insight into Canada and why I love it. If you do want to follow me on Instagram to keep up on my Canadian adventures, especially in Toronto, then I'm at Miss Rebecca J. This is a bit of a different video that I made. I usually make sort of travel and adventure videos, or I'm trying to. But before I did that, I thought I'd take a bit of an intermission and pause and explain to you why I want to travel this lovely country. So thank you for watching. Please leave a thumbs up and I will see you beauties next time.